Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. Once again, we're doing more creepy neighbor stories, since you guys seem to really like them. Shout out to Stories After Midnight for helping me out on today's video. I wasn't really feeling that well to record the last story, and he really helped me out. I've featured him on my channel a couple of times now, so you should already know who he is, but if you don't, definitely go check his channel out. Anyways, I guess that's all I have to say. I really hope you enjoy the stories, and without further ado, let's begin. And remember, stay hungry. This happened in 1996 when I just moved in with my husband in a military base in California. That base has since been long closed. My father-in-law had to come to visit for a few weeks, and we were just chilling at home at the time. The house that we lived in was connected to another one that was kind of like a condo, so the neighbor's wall was connected to ours. That meant that there was not really much soundproof. The military couple that we lived next to were nice enough at first, but the husband was kind of strange. Something about him was just really off. We had a pet cat who had once hissed when we walked by the house, and he never came in contact with her. She truly hated him even from a distance. Betty just knew something was up with him. Animals just know. She had never ever hissed at anyone else like that, just him. So I'm in another room working on crafts, then I hear a really big boom like something thrown against the wall or something. I ran out and I then asked my father-in-law if he heard it as well, and that's when he says to me, "Yeah, I did. It's coming from next door. I think something was slammed." I said okay, waited for a bit, and returned to the other room. Dad was watching TV. A couple of minutes later, the doorbell rings. It's my weirdo neighbor, and he's bent over and crying, holding something. I'm trying really hard to comprehend what the hell's going on and what he's holding. It's his cat, dead and bleeding right from his mouth. It was clearly internal injuries, right? I can't really make out what he's saying, but he said that he found him this way, and he doesn't know what happened. Just more bullcrap. My father-in-law was looking at him very, very suspiciously, then at me like, what the hell? And I knew what he was thinking. I thought it too. That really big boom that we had heard earlier was probably the cat being thrown against the wall. My father is literally the nicest dude, and he doesn't really judge people without knowing them first. But he definitely didn't like my neighbor, like at all. He pretty much immediately told me right after he left, "He did it. I know he did." We're both pretty damn sure that he did that to that poor cat. I knew it too. He was trying so hard to be all contrite and dramatic. I think that he came over because maybe he was shocked at what he did and needed to pretend to get help. I don't really know. The cat was definitely dead, no doubt too. There was really nothing that could be done at this point. It was a really young cat too. Not a kitten, but maybe around 7 months old or so. I can't really remember what he did with the cat afterwards, but it was really brutal. Especially when you just know there's foul play, but you can't really prove it. My father-in-law then tells me, "Please be careful. I know how people are. This dude is dangerous." I agreed, and I always did my best to keep a really polite distance. Certainly didn't want to rattle his cage. His wife was nice, but kind of in a clueless way, to be honest. We were all in our early 20s. The couple of times that I went in their house, there was literally garbage everywhere inside of it. There was literally trash everywhere. Cigarette butts, food packagings, clothes everywhere. Basically an indoor landfill. Believe it or not, the outside was actually cleaner. A few months later, they eventually moved out and they left trash everywhere on the sidewalk. Not even in bags though, like literally just thrown all over the place. The people that came to clean had one hell of a time to clean up their crap. I don't know whatever happened to these people, and trust me, I never cared to find out. I definitely think they had mental issues for sure. I really hope that he never hurt anyone or any other animals. Somehow, though, I just think that's wishful thinking. There's some seriously strange people running around in this world. So yeah, just watch your surroundings. I'm a female, and this happened about 5 to 6 years ago. I was about 16 to 17 years old at the time, and I lived with my mother and stepfather in the south of France, in a very small village out on the countryside. We had noticed this particular neighbor that was getting on our property more and more often, and whenever my stepfather confronted him on it, he always used the excuse of his work. He tends to sheep for a living, and he has a lot of property surrounding ours on every side. I had the worst gut feeling every time he was mentioned or when we had to see him. Then it got real really fast. The first occasion, I was cutting some carrots in the kitchen where there was a window just right in front of me. Out the window, there's about 3 meters of grass and a huge and thick wall of bamboo separating the properties. Suddenly, I see a head pop out from the bottom of the window, and I screamed. It really did feel like a movie scene, and it was very, very weird and creepy. The man was just there looking at me for about a half a second, then just ran off. My stepfather had heard my screams, ran after him, and then caught him. He again used the excuse of his sheeps. My stepfather got raging mad apparently, but I had to stay inside. The neighbor said that he'd never do it again and was just making sure that the fences for the sheeps were okay. The last thing that ever happened was the worst and most traumatic for me. My mom and stepfather had bought a small caravan that they had left in the garden. I used to want more freedom, and I asked if I could sleep in it at night instead of sleeping in the main house, which they said yes to. My stepfather's room is on the second floor, and his window looks out right into the garden where the trailer was. One morning he woke up, opened the blinds, and that's when he saw the neighbor there looking at me sleeping right through the window of the trailer. It was really early, probably around 6 to 7 in the morning. My stepfather couldn't run downstairs and catch him fast enough, as his gut reaction was to then scream as soon as he saw the creep. Of course, as soon as the man was caught, he ran away like a rabbit. My stepfather had calmed down and thought a lot about what he needed to do, and decided to go talk to him very calmly. I was still sleeping, so I didn't really have any idea what was happening until I woke up. My stepfather had apparently went up to his house, found him in his garage, and then told him something along the lines of, "Look, if you ever come into our property ever again with just 1 foot, I'll shoot you." And he never came again. He did go crazy though, and threatened to set himself on fire and burn down the whole village along with him. His father actually did exactly that before him, and actually burned down a part of their farm. I honestly used to feel really safe in the countryside, and I would always take walks at night in the nature. When this happened though, it made me think about how many times he was there lurking in the dark when no one saw him. It's just really creepy to think about. I live in a really small town in Arizona. It's in the Mojave Desert, and it's absolutely beautiful. Sparse, wide open spaces, but just really gorgeous, at least to me. When I was 15 years old, I was walking my dog in the summer at about 9 in the morning, and I was being followed by a big white truck. It looked a little beat up, but at first I just figured that it was someone new to town and maybe they were lost. I stopped and I waited for them to pull up next to me, presumably to roll down the window and maybe ask me for directions or something. Nope, they just stopped and just stayed there. I was really creeped out, but I was on my street, so I figured I could just go home and maybe call the cops if something were to happen. I keep walking. My dog is just happily jogging about and marking his territory with glee. As I turn us into our driveway, the car speeds up and pulls right up next to me. The driver rolls down his window, and a man with a brown beard and sunglasses leans over the passenger seat and then shouts at me.
"Hey, what are you doing?"
He then asked to very confuse me. I'm just walking my dog," I said.
"Why are you doing it so early?"
The man said. Because I don't want my dog or myself to die from a heat stroke." I had a bit of a tendency to be a bit of a smartass when I was a teenager, but I really was being sincere when I said it. Here in the Mojave, the temperatures in the summer can reach to the mid to high 120s later in the day.
You visiting someone?
That threw me off. I'm going home, I said, pointing to my house. The man just stares at me without really saying anything for a few more moments. I've never seen you around here before, he said. I've lived here for about 10 years now, I said, starting to feel equal parts of being really creeped out and annoyed. He didn't really seem to like that.
I'll be checking that out. We usually keep an eye out for suspicious individuals here,
he said. Good for you, I said, and I wasn't being sincere when I said that. I just started walking up my driveway at that point, then looking back to see that he was watching me the entire time. I pulled out my keys and opened the door and led my dog back inside. I shut and locked the door right behind me. My mom had already been up doing some work on the roof. Again, mid to high 120s in the middle of the day, and she was taking a break. I told her what happened and she was absolutely furious. She grabbed her hammer, walked right out the front door and down the driveway, but the weirdo was already gone by this point. Not even a full 5 minutes had gone by when the phone started to ring. We usually always let the answering machine get it. It was someone from the neighborhood watch notifying us that a suspicious individual was spotted on our property. My mom picked up the phone and hit the talk button, totally laying into this guy. She demanded to know why some freak was following her 15-year-old child around, and she used a lot of colorful language. She told me that the guy stammered a bit, and again that he was with the neighborhood watch. She then told the man that if anyone were to ever started following her child again, she was going to drag them out and then bash all of their teeth in with a hammer. Now, please bear in mind that normally my mom is very warm and bubbly. She just likes to make sure that someone who's messing with her kids know why it's a really bad idea. She then hung up and called one of her friends who was essentially pretty much in charge of the neighborhood watch, and much more calmly then explained the situation. As it turns out, apparently a new guy had moved into town pretty recently and he was very adamant about finding out if there was a neighborhood watch. When he heard that there was, he was very excited and then pretty much joined at the first opportunity. Apparently, he thought that he was actually a member of law enforcement, and he hadn't even been a member for more than a month and had already gotten 7 complaints prior. I guess he had seen a teenager and just thought I was a troublemaker or something. Not too long afterwards, he was eventually kicked out of the neighborhood watch, although I think there were some more complaints called in, but I'm not really sure. Either way, to the overzealous law enforcement wannabe of the neighborhood watch, for what it's worth, I really hope to not encounter you ever again.
For most of my childhood, my family and I lived one house away from a pedophile. For the sake of this story, I'll call him Mr. Stan. Our old neighborhood started at the top of a hill and went down to a small lake, where the road turned right and branched off into a cul-de-sac and another residential road. Mr. Stan's house was at the top of the hill, and ours was in the middle. Mr. Stan lived in the neighborhood long before we moved in. It's hard for me to remember any vivid details about him, as I was very young at the time, but what I do remember is that every time he saw us, his face would scrunch up as if he smelled something terrible. There was one house between his place and ours, something I am very grateful for. I don't know what life would have been like if we had to live right next to him. Right from when we were little, my parents were very strict about walking past Mr. Stan's house. They told us that Mr. Stan was sick in the head, and if he ever asked us to come into his house, we were never, ever allowed to do so by ourselves. For years, no one told us exactly why Mr. Stan was bad, but we didn't need details. We just knew to avoid him. The look he gave us whenever he was working on his car or planting flowers in his garden was enough. When my sister and I would walk up the hill to school, we would cross the street when we got to his place, just to be safe. Like I said, I don't remember very much about Mr. Stan, and his twisted story begins long before I was even born. For this, I turned to my mom to fill in the details. Mom said that before we'd ever moved into the cul-de-sac, around the late 70s, early 80s, Mr. Stan already had the reputation of being a heavy drinker. He would get drunk and go over to the house of the family right across the street from us to do terrible things to the daughter while she was babysitting. The daughter tried to tell her mother about it, but since she was a rebellious child, her mother didn't believe her. Her family and Mr. Stan's family were actually good friends. Mr. Stan worked as a corrections officer, and soon accusations surfaced that Mr. Stan and another officer regularly molested their co-workers' kids. Mr. Stan was able to avoid conviction by ratting out the other officer, but in the process he lost his job. As far as I know, he never really worked after that. Mr. Stan had 2 daughters of his own, and while the older one claimed she was molested and suffered from mental problems as a result, the younger one said she was never mistreated in any way and grew up to be a very positive person. Mr. Stan's wife stood by her husband and claimed he was innocent throughout the whole ordeal. Ironically, the older daughter's emotional instability resulted in her children going to live with Grandpa. More on that in a moment. When my family moved into our house in the cul-de-sac, our next-door neighbor, a kind but nosy old man, told my daughter to keep my sister and I away from Mr. Stan. He told my parents the gossip and Mr. Stan's history with children, which understandably horrified them both. As a result, my mom and dad were wary of him from the start. Mr. Stan was cordial, though. He would wave hello to my family and all that neighborly stuff. According to Mom, he even offered to babysit my little sister and I, to which my parents politely but emphatically declined. Then sometime around 2002, my dad was going to work when he came across a neighborhood kid, let's call her Lana, on her way up the street. My dad is a chatty person, and so he asked Lana what she was up to. Lana told him that she was going to Mr. Stan's house to give him a back rub. Dad knew that something was off, and so he told Lana's parents. To his surprise, they weren't alarmed at all and said that sort of thing happened all the time. According to Mom, when Lana was older, Dad asked her if Mr. Stan ever acted inappropriately toward her during those visits, and her answer was definitely. When my sister was in kindergarten and I was in grade 3, Mr. Stan's grandkids came to live with him and his wife for reasons I mentioned earlier. My parents couldn't believe this was allowed by anyone, especially considering the allegations and neighborhood gossip around Mr. Stan. His granddaughter was in the same kindergarten class as my sister, and his grandson was about my age. Mom told me that it was so disturbing to see this sweet little granddaughter at school every day and know what was probably going on behind closed doors. My parents have always had strong morals, particularly my dad. They would often talk about what they should do. They wanted to report Mr. Stan to the authorities before any harm could come to his grandchildren. Mom and Dad knew that if they reported Mr. Stan, they would be putting themselves at risk, and the rest of the neighborhood was no help. Mom said it was as if they were all hiding under rocks and turning a blind eye to what was happening. In the end, my parents' strong morality won out, and they decided, with the risk of being exposed as whistleblowers, to report Mr. Stan to the principal at my elementary school. The principal in turn called the ministry, who sent people to Mr. Stan's house for home visits and investigations. In the end, it was decided that the grandchildren would be removed from Mr. Stan's house. Mom isn't sure how it happened, but somehow it was leaked that my parents were the ones who reported Mr. Stan as a child molester. She thinks Lana's family may have had a hand in it, and as Mom put it, that's when the real fun began. Mr. Stan was no longer friendly toward my family. No more waves, no more chit-chat. Instead, he would target my mom with his car if she was walking down the road alone, or scream obscenities at my dad as he went to work. A few times he crossed the center line to scare us if we passed each other while driving. He told my dad that he ruined his life, and that he was a horrible person. Thinking about that now really boils my blood, because my dad is one of the kindest and most considerate men I know. Mom was miserable and wanted to move, but Dad, as unshakable as he is, said he wasn't in a hurry. Mom told me it took 3 years of house hunting before she finally convinced Dad it was time to go. Only after all of this, when we had been living in our beautiful new home out in the country, did I finally start to uncover the details to this story. But sadly, it doesn't end there. After we moved out of the cul-de-sac, Lana and other girls who were now grown up came forward to report Mr. Stan and what he had done. He was hauled into court for a second time, and this time there was no one he could rat on to save himself. The testimony against him was building up. My parents followed the trial in the newspaper. They wanted to see him put away for all the terrible things he'd done. I have no memories of these proceedings, of course, and nobody wanted to explain it to me. I don't blame them. Mr. Stan was not only a former corrections officer, but now he was also a convicted pedophile. He knew he would not last long if he went to prison. So, on a quiet morning, 1 week before his sentencing, Mr. Stan took a hunting rifle and shot himself. The folks who moved into Lana's house after her family left were walking their kids to school when they heard the shot. Mom tells me the image of that scene haunts her to this day. I think she imagines what it would have been like if it were her walking my sister and I to go to school in place of that other family. Or maybe she was disturbed to learn that Mr. Stan had a gun. I know it sounds harsh, but I'm glad he's gone. He can never hurt another child again. My memories of this whole ordeal are far less interesting than the actual event. But one thing I do remember very clearly is being afraid of Mr. Stan's house. I knew it was dangerous. In my memory, it was painted black with white stucco. The car park and stairs to the front door were all underneath a wood roof, which cast the entire front of the house into shadow. To me, it was a monster house, though I don't know why. My sister and I only ever went to Mr. Stan's front door once. It was Halloween and my parents decided it was okay for us to trick-or-treat at his house, since they would be standing at the bottom of the stairs. I was actually very reluctant to go, and my parents had to encourage me that it was okay. Mr. Stan's house was the only one that didn't need Halloween decorations to be scary. So my sister and I cautiously climbed the stairs and rang the doorbell. Mr. Stan's wife opened the door. She was kind to us and gave us candy, and I remember being surprised that Mr. Stan's wife was so nice. But what I remember most was that I wanted to see inside the forbidden house. For some reason, this has still stuck with me. I looked behind Mrs. Stan, and there was Mr. Stan in a wife-beater top, beer belly and all, sitting in an armchair watching TV. It was dim in the living room, except for a lamp and the glow of the TV. Mr. Stan didn't look at us. For years I wondered if that was what bad men looked like. When I think about this story now, 11 years later, it really hits me how dark my neighborhood was under the surface. It's quite disturbing to me, because my childhood was actually quite happy. I was too young to notice anything wrong. I couldn't sense the tension that my parents lived with every day. I didn't know how much potential danger my sister and I were in. All I knew was that it was a beautiful day to play with my marbles and go to the lake. But now that I think about it, Mr. Stan may have been the reason that my parents bought a copy of You Can Say No, a picture book that teaches children about safety around bad people. I think my parents handled the situation very well, and I am so thankful they were attentive and brave during the whole thing. This story could have gone very differently. When I think about our old house on the cul-de-sac, it's usually the happy memories I think of first. Mom tells me that despite all the trouble they went through, neither she or Dad regret the decisions they made, and she left me with one last ominous message. They say that every neighborhood has a pedophile living there. Most of the time, we just don't know it.
I'm a female, and my parents got divorced when I was 10 years old and my brother was 8. They had bought a house on some fairly big land and decided to split it. The house was demolished and my mom was building a new house to live with me and my brother. We also lived in a very small city that was pretty well known for its safety. Fast forward to when I was 15, now 25, and the house still wasn't ready. Me and my brother and my mom lived in an apartment that was pretty close by to where we were building the house, so from time to time we would go and check it out. It was an evening. Me and my mom were getting back from the market and we decided to go check out the house. As we were parking in front of the house, the car light shows a man trying to jump the fences to get in. I was really freaked out, but my mom stepped out of the car and then shouted to the man, "Hey, what the hell are you trying to do?" It was some old guy, maybe around his late 60s. He was really tall, white and skinny, and balding. He just sent really creepy vibes to us. He jumped out of the fence and he looked kinda scared. I guess he wasn't expecting someone to show up because no one had lived in that place yet. He said that he lived in the apartment building that was right next to the house and that he was trying to cut down a branch from a tree that was knocking on his window. So my mom said that he was trespassing and that if he wanted to do something in her house, he really should have contacted her. She yelled at him to go away and never come back. We went home and we never really talked about it after that. A couple of months later, my family finally moved into the house. It was a really cute house with lots of trees and a lot of space for my dogs to run free. At the time, we had 3 dogs, 2 small ones and a border collie that we rescued. Every day, we would always hear a teenage female voice yelling at the apartment building right next to our house. We figured that it was just some teenage drama because we could always hear her saying things that every teen has said to their parents, like, "I don't want to live here," or "You don't get me at all." So we never really did anything about it. Some time had passed and one of my best friends moved into an apartment that was in that building. She said that she could always hear the teen yelling at her father. And guess who the father was? Yes, it was the same man that was trying to get inside our yard. I've got to be honest, it kind of freaked me out a little bit. But I mean, I didn't really have any proof that he was doing something to her. One evening, I was eating some fruits in front of my house with my dogs, and that's when I heard some screams. It sounded like a man and a woman were fighting. I looked around and that's when I figured out that it was coming from the building right next to my house. As I looked to the building, I saw that there was a woman falling from the balcony, but I couldn't really see if anyone had pushed her. So I decided to call an ambulance and they actually got here really fast and took her to the hospital. At the same time, the police came. They took him in, but I couldn't really get a good look to see if it was the same man that had trespassed here. I didn't really get to know what happened on the day that all happened, or who the man was. My dad had started building his house next to my mom's. I spent a lot of time in my best friend's apartment that was right next to the creepy guy's apartment. As I said before, my yard was filled with a lot of trees and sometimes we could see animals there, like lizards, snakes, fox, possums, you name it. On this day, me and my friend were in our balcony and we could actually see a lizard that was walking in the wall that separated my house and the building. In the balcony right next to hers, the creepy man showed up with a gun trying to shoot the lizard. We then started screaming and begging for him to not kill the lizard. He started to look at us like he was really surprised or something. I guess he thought he was alone. The man didn't say anything and just went back into his apartment. I decided to tell my dad about it, but he just said that I shouldn't be interacting with him. I was already 18 and things started to calm down now, or so I thought. It was an afternoon around 4 p.m. and I was home alone. I decided to go for a walk with my dog. She's really sweet and I used to ride my bike as she would follow me running. So I did that. As we were coming back to my house, just passing by the building, that man then throws a really big rock right at my dog. She was running, so the rock hit her leg. I started cursing at the man, get back in my house, and looked at my dog to see if she was hurt. I told my mom, and she pretty much just told me that I just shouldn't walk alone anymore. A couple of days later, I had found a really cute but skinny cat at my college. I was sitting down smoking, and this cat jumped up in my lap. I came back to watch a class with him in my lap. He pretty much slept through the entire class. I decided to come back home with him. He was orange and fierce. As he was a street cat before, we had let him go for walks in my street. Everyone really liked him. He was a really friendly cat and he always wanted everyone to pet him. Really surprisingly, people would often let him in their houses and frequently send my mom pictures of the cat on their yards or sofas. So we never really thought he was bothering someone by walking around. At this time though, we had actually started to forget about the violent nature from our neighbor. My family went on a trip to go and visit my grandma, and my dad had stayed behind to take care of our pets. He said on one night he had heard some footsteps around his house, but as he walked out the front door, he couldn't really see anyone. He thought that it was just the dogs messing around and went back to his house to sleep. When we came back, we had then realized that one of the trees in my mom's backyard was dying. It was a really big tree, around 100 years old, I think. I want to mention that this tree is the biggest one in the yard, and it was always so beautiful. So my dad went to look at the tree, and that's when he figured out that there was a lot of holes in it. My dad had told us that there's a certain way to get poison inside of the tree so that it'll kill it. He also told us that we shouldn't tell my mom because it was probably going to scare her and make her really sad, because the trees were the main reason that she even bought the place. So I never told her about it. Some time had passed by and me and my brother had moved out to another town to go and finish our studies. I really wanted to take my cat with me, but my mom said that it was going to be hard for him to adapt living in an apartment. He really likes so much to walk around, so I eventually agreed that he should just stay with my mom. A couple of days later, my mom had visited me, and that's when she told me that my cat had died. I was broken. How did it happen? She found him with his neck broken right in front of the apartment building next to our house. His head was twisted, but my cat was still alive. But as she arrived in the vet, my cat had already died. My mom firmly believes that she thinks it was the man that killed him. We don't have any proof, but you know that feeling when you just know it? That was the feeling we had. I cried about it so much, and even just writing about it now still makes me cry. He was my first cat ever, and he was just so sweet. My mom still lives in that same house. She has 5 cats now, but none of them go out. That same creepy man still lives next to her. I'm with her during quarantine, and I pretty much see the man all the time. He walks past our house pretty frequently, and he's always looking up to see if someone's in there. I really wish I could end this story by saying that I never saw him again, but unfortunately, I still have to see him almost every day. It really sucks.